Welcome back. Let's take you to our focus for the day, and that is that the state of our rail network is actually at a dire state. The crumbling rail network and infrastructure has had a negative impact on exports and in turn the economy. The mining sector, for instance, is one of the hardest hit. This hour, we're looking at who exactly stands to benefit from the destruction of the country's rail network and its infrastructure. Let's speak now to economist Dawie Roodt. Mr. Roodt, thank you very much for your time here on ENCA. Just first of all, when we look at Transnet, they reported a 120 billion rand economic or financial crisis rather for this current financial year. So already you can understand the kind of situation it puts us in, because if, as South Africans, we say Eskom is the backbone of our economy, Transnet is probably the spine.
Indeed so. Transnet is very, very important to the South African economy for a number of reasons. As we know, most of the state-owned enterprises have been run into the ground. Transnet, like most of the other state-owned enterprises, are very, very deep in a financial hole. They've just made a loss of about close to 6 billion rand. That hole needs to be filled somewhere. And in the meantime, the finances are also in very, very deep trouble. Now, Transnet are important because, for the obvious reason, they are exporting stuff out of South Africa. We know recently that commodity prices have been coming down. We don't have electricity to take the stuff out of the ground. Now we don't have trains to get it to the harbors. And if you can't get it to the harbors don't work properly. And the impact on the mining industry is really, really huge. And the Minister of Finance is being affected by that as well, because his revenue is under tremendous pressure because of amongst that. And obviously those industries, especially mining and agriculture, is being affected. But that's not all. Many other industries are also affected, because if the trains don't work properly, then people start making use of alternative transport, like, for example, the trucks on our roads.
Yes.
And the trucks are destroying the roads as well. And the roads, as we know, are crumbling and falling apart, and we need to reinvest in the roads as well. So it is crucially important that we get Transnet back and up and running again.
And, you know, a lot of people would say, who benefits from this? Is it the people in the trucking industry because they keep getting the contracts? Is it the people who are supposed to fix our roads and infrastructure for the trucks to use this? Who's benefiting from this? From the destruction of Transnet, that is.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting more and more skeptical just about everything in South Africa. I will not be surprised, let me put it to you, that if there are some people at work within Transnet, like we know there are some issues within Eskom as well, so that could be a possibility. I've heard rumors of people that's got a reason why they don't want Transnet to work, because they have interest in the trucking industry, as an example. I've witnessed myself the kind of trucks on the roads in South Africa, and this is really, really good and big business in South Africa. I won't be surprised if there could be somebody that's got a certain interest in the transport industry, or trains not working properly, as an example. You mentioned some other infrastructure, like, for example, the roads, and people getting involved and supposed to be fixing the roads. The answer is, I just don't know. There are so many issues and things that are working incorrectly in South Africa that I'm getting worried about just about everything. And if you ask me what we should do about this, again, I don't really know what to answer on that one, because this is a typical example of what economists call a natural monopoly. It makes sense if something like this belongs to the state. So the state should actually provide for infrastructure like this. But the state is clearly not capable of doing this. So what is happening? The next step seems to me as if the private sector is going to get involved, and the private sector will sort of take over some of these concessions. And in fact, that is already happening, which is unfortunate, I get, to an extent.
And that's where I was going. You know, could it be that, part of the downfall of Transnet, besides the corruption that we've seen, cases that we're seeing, the SIU getting involved, etc., probably the inefficiencies rather come from the fact that it's a monopoly. So it shuts out every other business, and it's just red tape everywhere. And therefore, it cannot be assisted. When it falls, the rest of the country falls with it.
Yeah, but Transnet and pretty much the transmission lines of Eskom is a similar kind of problem. It is what economists call a natural monopoly. You can't really get proper competition there, because it doesn't make sense to have two transmission networks right to one another. or two different transport companies running a railroad, one right next to another. So that's why it's called a natural monopoly. But you can get competition in there. You can, for example, concession the running of this out to the private sector, and you can get the private sector to tender on those concessions. So it is possible, despite the fact that it is a natural monopoly, it is certainly possible to get the private sector involved. But even whether you like the private sector getting involved or not, the reality is that the state has proved itself to be incapable of running these kind of stuff. And if we don't get somebody to do the job and do a proper job, then I'm afraid the economy is going to suffer tremendously, like what we are seeing already.
And at the end of the day, even if the private sector comes in, the infrastructure still belongs to the state. And the infrastructure is also a problem. People stealing cables, the vandalism that's been happening, and the not fixing and maintaining the infrastructure at the end of the day is also going to have the private sector that wants to assist fall to its knees anyway if the state can't get it together with its own infrastructure.
Well, that actually points to another deficit or another problem in the state, and that's the way that the police is run in South Africa. So clearly, the police is not capable of running to protect the infrastructure in South Africa. I think in the end, what we are witnessing here is what we are witnessing in so many other places in South Africa, and that is just a lack of competent leadership. That I think is the reason. We've just seen the resignation of many senior people at Transnet. They simply couldn't make it. There's a lot of talk about politicians involved in trying to micromanage the various state-owned enterprises. So I guess in the end, this is really about leadership. And you and I, we've spoken about this previously. We have many economic problems in South Africa, but those problems can be solved. The main issue in South Africa is actually political. So we need to fix our political issues first before we will be able to fix all those economic and financial issues.
Definitely political buy-in. And I think for me, Dawie, the other problem that I see, remember the labor disputes that we saw starting at Eskom, after Eskom workers downed tools for that 7% wage increase. We saw Transnet also follow because they could see that they can also get away with it even though they are deemed essential workers. That affected our ports of entry. KZN is a major, a partner in terms of the ports of entry with business. So that affected businesses as well. But also, if the marine workers also worked at a skeleton level, it meant that we were not safe in South Africa in terms of who can come in and out.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to manage and to handle a labor issue just before an election. We know there's an election around the corner, and of course politicians are not going to take a stance against labor so soon before an election. And again, it points to one problem that we have in South Africa, and that is actually politics. You're absolutely correct.
Well, Dawie, hopefully there are politics or political or people in these positions who will actually at least give business the political buy-in. And I just want to ask you one last question. We've heard from a lot of ministers and people in government saying that business is boycotting, partnering with government when it comes to these issues. So for me, it's two ways. Either business really is or there's no truth to that. Or if they are, it's probably because the corruptor and the corruptee, there's been a trust deficit now suddenly between them.
But there's a huge trust deficit in South Africa and also in the South African government. And that is a fact. We've got the data to actually prove this. But, I really don't blame the private sector here. The private sector will go into a transaction if they think there's money to be made. The private sector does not want to go into business with government quite often, simply because government cannot be trusted for a variety of reasons. And I know of many instances where the private sector simply say, listen, it doesn't matter whether I get the contract or not. I'm just not prepared to go into business with government because I cannot trust them. So I'm afraid there's a huge trust deficit in South Africa. And looking at what's happening in the South African economy, I guess this trust deficit is going to be with us for until at least after the election. So as far as what it seems to me, what I think can be expected, is the private sector simply waiting it out to see what the election is going to look like and see who's going to be the next government and see whether that government can actually get the private sector or to get investors generally to start trusting government again. The trust deficit is certainly there at the moment.
And I mean, a lot of people in business would say every time I want to contract with certain government entities, I have to make sure that I have money to give the kickback to get the contract.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and all sort of other social and political requirements as well. Now, it's very difficult to do business in this country.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for speaking to us, Dawie. It's going to be a very interesting few months in the run-up to those elections. Economist Dawie Roodt, thank you for your time.